Got it. Okay. You're all very welcome, everybody, to this, the 14th iteration of the Dante lecture series. And we started this back in 2011. Before we begin today, I want to just pay tribute to somebody who is very important to our Dante series, because last November, Professor Terence O'Reilly of the Spanish department here in UCC very sadly passed away. But as many of you will recall, way back in 2011, when we started the Dante lecture series, Terry was in the first lineup of speakers to, and he gave the final lecture of that series on Dante and Beatrice. And it was a really wonderful lecture, and people who knew Terry would know that he was a Hispanist. He was a wonderful scholar, but what he was also was a wonderful colleague, because I remember going up to him the year previously. I had this idea to start off a lecture series on Dante, and it was really Terry who, more than anybody else, encouraged me to go pursue it, to go with it, and he said, if you need, I can give you a paper too. And he was a very humble man, and I said, yes, please, that would be wonderful. And he gave the most exquisite lecture, very nuanced lecture on the subject of Dante and Beatrice. So and he came every year when he could, before he became ill, and supported the series, and was just a wonderful interlocutor, a great supporter, a wonderful colleague. And with his passing, we with him passed I suppose something that we're missing more and more in the humanities, just colleagues who were really looking out for each other, a wonderful sense of collegiality, and who really genuinely, passionately care about the subjects that they work on. Terry, as I said, is a Hispanist, specializing in Golden Age and medieval Spanish literature, but he could turn his hand to anything. And one of the last things he gave me when I last met him was a wonderful translation that he had done by himself of Petrarch, the final poem of Petrarch's Canzonieri. So hopefully we'll find a place and get that published in the next couple of years. So I just wanted to start this year's lecture series just to remember Terry and thank him for his friendship, his collegiality, his erudition and scholarship, and he'd be sadly missed. Okay, that is something I think was necessary, but I just want to say one or two other things about this series before we introduce this evening's speaker. This series happens every year, and it has been happening every year for the last 14 years. And it is thanks in large part to a number of different bodies who have funded us, who encourage us. And I want to thank my colleagues in the Department of Italian in particular, but also in the wider School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures. It's a great place to work. Some of our colleagues will be leaving us later in the year to go off to Pastors New, but I think when they get to those Pastors New, they'll think, I'm just looking at you, Pat, they'll think back to some of the things that we've been able to do as a school. And I have to say, on a personal level, it's a genuine pleasure to work in a school like the School of Languages. And I also want to mention Pat here, because I know Pat will be leaving us at the end of the academic year, and he's going to go away, and we wish him every success. But Pat too has been a great supporter of this series of the Centre for Dante Studies here in Ireland, and I just wanted on the record that I am genuinely grateful to you, Pat, for your friendship and for your support. So thank you. As I said, CASILAC then, the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures, is a great supporter, and also the Society for Italian Studies, which is our disciplinary body who help fund these events. And every year we try to come up with a very interesting panel of speakers from different kinds of backgrounds. And I suppose since COVID, it's become more and more specialized, and our ability to attract more and more Dantisti in the international sphere has also been greatly enhanced. And I'm genuinely delighted to introduce today's speaker, because I've known Franziska now for a number of years. We met many, many years ago in Apiro, probably the best meal of my life, a 9-course meal. And I I remember ringing my wife saying, I'm not coming home, I like this place too much. But I was seated beside Franziska, and we began to talk, and I began to learn about Dante studies in Germany, and the wonderful tradition, the oldest Dante society in the world. It's not in Italy or in Oxford, but it's actually in Germany. And I had the great fortune last November to go to her university for a wonderful conference on Boccaccio's Esposizioni su Dante, and it was it was a wonderful conference. It was one of those conferences that was really well focused, and everybody there was at the top of their game and talking about things which were very, very interesting. So it's great to kind of see Dante outside of the Italian and the Anglophone context, and for this reason, not the only reason, I'm delighted that Franziska is here. She's a wonderful Dantista. Franziska is Professor of French and Italian Literature at the Georg August University of Göttingen in Germany. She's also the founder of the Göttingen Dante Forum. Much of her present research details the kind of poetic and rhetorical aspects of Dante's work. Her most recent publications include, and there were numerous articles in there, and I would recommend that you go to her website and download her CV. It is very, very impressive. But I would mention also from in recent times, Dante's Convivio, or How to Restart Writing in Exile from 2018, and Poesia e Diritto nel 200 Italiano in 2019, just to name some of her books. Fascinating topic this evening, and I see one or two people from the law faculty here. And the topic of today's talk is who is responsible for justice, the lawyers or the poets? So will you please join me in welcoming Franziska.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for the presentation, introduction. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Cork, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting all these PhD students. Some of them I met Saturday night, and it's wonderful to be welcomed by such a group of Dantisti. Who is responsible for justice, the lawyers or the poets? There has been much research on Dante's detailed and thorough knowledge of law. The most prominent example might be Justin Steinberg's monograph, Dante and the Limits of the Law, published in 2013. Steinberg does not only highlight the extent to which legal thinking and methods had an impact on the Divine Comedy, he also showed Dante's subtle understanding and critical staging of law systems. Recently, Steinberg published a second monograph that is focused on Giovanni Boccaccio. Law and Mimesis in Boccaccio's Decameron is the title. And as far as the still growing interest in the connection of poetry and law in the 14th century is concerned, Steinberg's challenging research is only the tip of the iceberg. My lecture today, however, differs from this scholarly pursuit, which brings to the fore to what extent the three Italian crowns had been profound connoisseurs as well as critiques of the contemporary law systems and their shortcomings or even failures, and to what extent legal knowledge had an impact on their poetic text. I'm rather intrigued by the fact that the three crowns, who had such a profound knowledge of the law, made a point in distancing themselves from lawyers and legal experts. Whereas the above-mentioned approach had the ambition to uncover the impact juridical thoughts and practices had on the poet's writing, I'm rather concerned with the self-fashioning of the authors and the reasons why they started criticizing lawyers and separating the poets from them. The split between poets and lawyers is usually linked to Francesco Petrarca and Giovanni Boccaccio. In the second half of the 14th century, both engaged in a fierce combat against experts of law. Retrospectively, they presented the study of law at the universities, Petrarch in Bologna, Giovanni Boccaccio in Naples, as a tremendous waste of time for the humanist endeavor. They had been forced by their fathers to study law as the best way to find a lucrative job. Both conveyed their strong dislike of law in their auto or biographical writings. Petrarch attacked lawyers also in some of his treatises. Accordingly, Francesco Bruni stated in his book on Boccaccio that it is with Petrarch and Boccaccio, and now I translate the Italian phrase, it is really with these two authors that the intellectual formation of authors and lawyers split. In this lecture, however, I intend to use Petrarch and Boccaccio as points of reference to better understand Dante and his relation to lawyers. In my view, Dante played a key role in the process of differentiating poetry from law and of fashioning the poet as a leading figure in the quickly changing society of the comuni. In Dante, we reach a crossroads, so to speak, in how the relation between poets and lawyers changed profoundly. The close connection between law and poetry is part of what we may call now a master narrative in the history of early Italian literature. It is common to refer to the first poets at Frederick II's imperial court in the first half of the 13th century as being civil servants coming from a juridical or notarial formation to the imperial court where they worked as secretaries. This picture remains more or less intact when we direct our attention to middle or northern Italy. Guido Guinizelli, for instance, whom Dante claimed to be the father of the Dolces di Nuovo, was a trained lawyer and judge. Among Dante's contemporaries and friends, Cino da Pistoia certainly stands out. He will be celebrated both as a love poet and as the first commentator of the Roman Corpus Juris Civilis. If we now turn to the readership, we get a similar picture. The first dabblers and copyists of early Italian poetry are lawyers, in particular notaries in Bologna. It is known that they scribbled some of Dante's early sonnets into the so-called memoriali, in books in which any contract concluded in Bologna among citizens was registered on behalf of the government. These books that can still be studied in the archive of Bologna make palpable the firm connection, if not symbiosis, between vernacular poetry and law practice. If we give credit to the scholars of medieval law history, this symbiosis can be traced back to a specificity in the medieval curriculum. From the 12th century onwards, law students had been required to study the liberal arts first, most of all grammar, that is Latin, rhetoric, and dialectic. Only after concluding the trivium, they would start studying law. Now, the explanation of the close connection goes like this. Since they learned Latin by reading ancient texts, they became not only familiar with Cicero, Ovid, and Horace, but also became enthralled by the beauty of poetry. And you may presume that the professional daily work of a lawyer or notaries was not that thrilling. It makes sense to imagine them passing their spare times by reading poetry and by amusing themselves with Ovid while being at work. The same, as you probably know, goes for the nuns and monks in monasteries. Diego Quaglioni, an outstanding historian of medieval law, brought our attention to the fact that even in the brief comments on the Roman Corpus Juris, reference to poetical text do appear. Surprisingly, even the Roman love poet Ovid is mentioned as an authority, which meant that his pronouncement, his rhymes were beyond doubt. He seemed to have had the same weight as other exclusively juridical authorities. This appreciation of poetry culminates in a comment written by Bartolo di Sassoferrato on Dante's canzone Le dolci rime d'amore. Although he criticizes Dante's point of view, he considers the canzone as an important and well-argued statement in the contemporary debate on the definition of nobility. If we take the great historian Ernst Kantorowicz into consideration, we get the sense that poets as well were strongly influenced and stimulated by juridical thinking. According to Kantorowicz, the use of juridical fictions in the Roman law prepared the way for the idea of a fiction of the artist as a creator equal to God. This master narrative, suggested by historians of medieval law, was approved and shared by historians of early Italian literature for a long time. They brought into play the term poeta giurista that mirrored the strong symbiotic connection. This understanding was underpinned by Dionysotti's research, and accordingly, in the 13th and early 14th century, many poets made a living as lawyers, notaries, or legal counselors. During the 14th century, however, that is the generation of Petrarch and Boccaccio, poets rather found a living within the church that offered sinecures that did not even require the presence of the poets. Thus, it looks as if the divorce between lawyers and poets that Francesco Bruni had stated may well reflect a real shift in the professional paths of poets at that time. The coincidence is tempting. However, I'm wondering whether the divorce began earlier and had other reasons. My question is whether the lawyer's love of poetry had been returned by the poets. I have already shown in an article that the poems of the so-called Sicilian school did not highlight the figure of the poeta giurista. If we read the text written by the emperor's civil servants, whose juridical affiliations were strongly marked in the Siculo-Tuscan manuscripts, the later manuscript, they rarely hint at the poet's profession. Within his lyrical production, the much-quoted self-description in Giacomo da Lentini's poem Meravigliosamente is an exception. Here he says, "Lo vostro amor che caro, donatelo al notaro che è nato da Lentino." Your love, which is very, very dear, give it to the notary who is born in Lentino. Usually, the poet Lentini was not keen on speaking about his profession, although his successors, such as Dante, would call him notaro. We may speculate on the reasons. In these lines, you may have already noticed that notaro rhymes with caro, a word with two meanings in Italian. And I trust that Lentini would have preferred to avoid the second meaning that is, it costs a lot. In fact, if we look at the entire corpus of Sicilian poetry, the poets rather toyed with their geographic provenance. Giacomo Lentini refers to a place called Lentino, many others to the city of Messina. And they do so to such an extent that I'm wondering if Messina had really been their birthplace at all. Interestingly, according to law, one of the poets whose name was Protonotaro was a notary. He actually comes from a place called Protonotaro, which you can find in Puglia. The reason why they use Lentino or Messina is easy to guess. The ending ina, ino rhymes with the buzzword of that time and alludes to high poetry with amor fino. Fin amor, the Provençal term that stipulates what good poetry should be about, even more so at the imperial court, since the political dimension of poetry had been almost suppressed in Sicily. In other words, in their role as poets, the Sicilian civil servants preferred adapting their names, their self-representation to the Occitan model. They wanted to be troubadours, as well love poets. They wanted to be experts on a form of love that in their view embraced scientific and philosophical thinking. Interestingly, the French mixing of love and law in the so-called court of love, presided over by gentle women, ladies, did not resonate in the early vernacular poetry in Italy. In short, the tradition of calling the early Italian poets by their profession, notary or judge, seems to be rooted in the later manuscript tradition. I suppose that it was introduced and perpetuated by copyists who did not live at courts, but in communal cities governed by powerful guilds. To conclude the story of the most likely unrequited love between poets and lawyers, I would like to draw your attention to Dante's friend, Cino da Pistoia. His case is mysterious, almost schizophrenic. Cino seems to have kept his love poetry and his main juridical work separate, in particular his innovative work on the Corpus Juris. It strikes me that as noteworthy that one of his rare poems without any hint at love, and I'm referring to his Complaint of Naples, was all about the lack of courtly and gentle manners in a French marked kingdom that, as he said, paradoxically imposed a tyranny. Although we do not know much about the years he spent in Naples around 1331, he seemed to have actually been repulsed by his working and teaching in the studio in a civil law department. However, this real reason of his outburst apparently was not allowed to enter his poem. Furthermore, the schizophrenic outline of his interest in law and poetry is continued by his readers in the 14th century as well as today's. After Cino's death, the lawman Bartolo di Sassoferrato commemorated the merits of the commentator of the Roman law, whereas Petrarch and Senuccio del Bene mourned the departure of a great lover and great love poet. The only trace left of his profession in their poems was the title Messere, and which denotes the high level of education. Dante knew the manuscript tradition and used the definitions of the Sicilian poets. He could not present himself as a legal expert because he had not studied law. In the Vita Nova, he presents himself as a poet. There is no hint as his being involved with law or with questions of justice. This topic of justice comes up later in the so-called Canzoni Morali. The most important example is the canzoni Tre donne intorno al cor mi son venute, that has the third largest position in the later collection of his canzoni. By presenting this canzone as the first indication of legal concerns in Dante's work, I place it at the beginning of the 14th century. However, I admit it is controversial when Dante exactly wrote this poem. Most argue for a time before Dante started writing the Convivio, as I do, and in this first text in exile he points at a 14th book which he planned to dedicate to the question of justice, but never did. Most scholars consider the Canzone Tre donne to be the most likely poetical text Dante would have commented on. Others such as Marco Grimaldi and recently Lorenzo Bartolo, date the writing of the canzoni at a later time. In their view, the poem responds to the circumstance of the emperor's descent to Italy, and particularly to the amnesty that the city of Florence offered to the many exiles. Dante, however, had been excluded from the list. Let us have a look at the canzone. Dante speaks of a lady he calls Drittura. She addresses God Amor and tells him about the sorrows of life. She had been expelled from the city and she is in very bad condition. Her clothes are torn and she is forced into begging. She calls herself the sister of Venus and thus the cousin of Amor. By doing so, she aligns herself with the goddess Astrea, whose name, however, is not mentioned in the poem. Solicited by Amor, she introduces her two companions, her daughter, whom she had begotten at the source of the Nile, which is here, Nile, Nilo Piccolo Fiume, she says, Sopra la Vergine Onda, and you have it on the, you see a little stream, and it's the Virgin Wave, you see at the bottom of the slide. And then she speaks about her granddaughter who had begotten a female child by watching her reflection in the clear water of a fountain. It goes back to Pietro Alighieri's comment that the three ladies are considered allegories of the three types of law. The first lady, the Tura, represents the jus naturale, that is, the divine and natural law. Her daughter corresponds to the jus gentium, that rules the relationship between nations, whereas her granddaughter represents the jus civile, which each community gives itself, and which, at Dante's time, strongly differed from place to place. My first question concerns the term Drittura. Why did Dante choose it, and what are its connotations? Does it differ from the term Justitia? And if it does, in what aspect? If we look at the Tesoro della Lingua Italiana delle Origini, the word Drittura primarily refers to a material or a line which is oblique and needs to be straightened. From the linguistic point of view, the idea of straight, dritto, prevails. It is the second meaning in which the moral aspect emerges. It implies that a behavior, a style of life, requires to be corrected, to be brought to the right path. The examples which the Tesoro, this dictionary, offers stress an activity whose aim is to lead an individual or group back to the righteous path. According to the Ottimo comment on Dante's comedy, the opposite to the Drittura is iniquitate, a term that again implies an activity turned against what is straight and righteous. Thus, Drittura is conceived of as a virtue that acts upon human beings. Against this backdrop, it looks as if justice is rather a reaction to something that took already place. Traditionally, justice uses the balance and the sword to righten wrongs. Do we then infer from these definitions that Dante selected the virtue of Drittura because he wanted to shift his speech away from law towards ethics, a science, according to medieval thinking, that does not fall in the field of lawyers, but into that of rhetoric and later philosophy? In fact, from a historical perspective, it seems as if Dante wanted to shift the law back into the field of liberal arts, where it used to reside. Before the rediscovery of the corpus juris, the corrupt occupation with law was part of rhetoric. This early association that sounds strange to us is likely to stem from the Roman tradition of legal court speeches, a central performance of the Roman rhetoric. It is only after the rediscovery of the Corpus Juris that the reading and commenting of single cases assembled in the corpus gradually became a science for its own sake and emerged to be one of the driving disciplines within the universities as well as in social and political life. I am not sure whether Dante was aware of this former link to rhetoric. At a closer look, it rather seems that he tried to assign reflections of justice back again to moral philosophy, that is, to ethics, that had become popular in the wave of the reception of Aristotle's philosophy in the 13th century. It rather seems to me that Dante claimed that justice is a virtue and not a science or practice. There's another aspect in the poem that caught my attention. It is the way in which three different sorts of law are connected. I do not mean the threefold division itself, which is quite common in the Middle Ages. You also find it in the Decretum Graciani, the standard text of canon law, or more precise is in the 6th paragraph, that goes jus aut natural est, aut civile, aut gentium. There's always an out entry. There's nothing new about the fact that the natural law is presented as a mother, or the cause of all the other laws, and therefore above the two other types. On the contrary, it is a current metaphor that used to be proverbial, and for instance is set at the beginning of the Glossa Ordinaria. It is striking that and how Dante set the three laws in a hierarchy or in a genealogy. Why does he place the jus civile at the end? That is actually the foundation of the jus gentium. And why does he add the metaphor of the virginal conception without any external or male intervention? The only external element turns out to be the water of the river Nile, and water in Italian, aqua, is a female word. It hints at something transparent, if not at something like the ritual of baptism or of cleaning. By the way, intriguingly, a similar series of generation emerges in Dante's reflection on human art in relation to nature and to God, though in the comedy he features a relation based on imitation instead of virginal conception. These lines in the canzone suggest that everything starts with a natural or divine law that can be traced back in the Holy Scriptures. It is true that the canzone does not contain any insult against lawyers. However, it implies a much more substantial and fundamental criticism. In fact, it visualizes a concept of justice that goes back to God's will and does not need any comments or supplements or modifications, any human intervention. To put it bluntly, it does not need to be touched and elaborated by lawyers. Therefore, it is possible to remove drittura from a city while the courts and the lawyers go on carrying out their work undisturbed. The drittura indeed does not apply laws. It is a moral virtue that aims to return human beings or society to a more righteous way of living. It does not come as a surprise that the poetical eye does not present itself as a law expert, but as a lover, in whose heart God Amor reigns, a master or signore, whose function has passed a kind of ethical turn. He is no longer the god of profane love. After having shown Dante the way to Beatrice, Amor here conveys to his servant Dante a consciousness or a competency in ethics. Thanks to god Amor, the poetical eye is capable of encountering Lady Drittura and of understanding what had happened to her. Moreover, he even recognizes a parallel between the lady and himself. They both had been driven out of the city and forced to live in exile. although at the end the poetical eye asks for the favor of being welcomed back in his hometown, in the canzone the wish of playing an important moral role emerges clearly. As the city is devoid of drittura, it is supposed to need someone who may bring the virtue back and spread it within the walls of the city. In the canzone, however, Dante does not make his ambition explicit. He alludes to it in a rather indirect way, that is, by the parallelism with the lady. However, it is puzzling that the poet admits that he is not without a fault and he is ready to repent. Does he intend to say that while listening to the Ritura, he senses and absorbs her beneficial virtue and therefore may pass the learned lesson on to others? In the last stanza remains enigmatic. The shifting of justice to moral philosophy, however, is clearly delineated. In the Convivio, Dante again speaks of the law, but this time he uses the word justitia. He also openly addresses law experts for the first time. Before analyzing the few passages on justice scattered throughout the Convivio, I would like to highlight one passage in which Dante attacks lawyers. In the first book of the Convivio,
Something's appeared there.
okay.
Snooze, right?
Yeah. In the first book of the Convivio, he does not attack them directly. He rather verbally attacks literati, those who can read and write in Latin. The first insult against lawyers emerges in the fourth and last book of the Convivio that is dedicated to the definition of nobility. The attack, however, mixes the lawyers with the medical doctors, which means that he addresses the representatives of the two most recent university disciplines. In his long discourse on how to define nobility, Dante figures out that his main enemies come from these two fields that are set apart from the ancient university disciplines such as theology and philosophy. He reproaches them to sell what they had learned, for instance, by writing well-remunerated evaluations. If you read this here, some doctor or lawyer might say, am I then to carry my counsel and offer it even though it has not been asked for and make no profit from my art? I reply, as our Lord has said, freely have you received, freely give. I say, therefore, my dear lawyer, that those counsels which are unrelated to your art and which proceed only from the common sense which God has given to you, and this is that prudence of which we are now speaking, you should not sell to the children of him who gave it to you. Those that are related to your art, which you have purchased, you may sell, but not such that it's not fitting at times to pay the tithe and make an offering to God. Whereas in the case of the literati, who according to Dante sold a good, the knowledge of Latin, that should be offered for free to everybody, in the case of the lawyers and doctors, Dante severely criticizes the so-called consilia, the practice of evaluation. Dante strongly distinguishes between common sense and knowledge acquired through university learning. It is not the latter that they have the right to monetize. I confess that I am still puzzled over the very difference between the two forms of knowledge. It is very likely that the distinction had not been clear-cut and that Dante pointed at something altogether different. The fact remains. Dante's wording makes it clear that many questions and issues that are brought to justice or to court could have been or could be solved by using common sense. In other words, it seems that if Dante wanted to separate from the new scientific discipline of law a form of justice that he considered to be part of the public domain, so to speak. In Dante's view, justice and the fact of administering justice to the citizen should be neatly separated from the theoretical and practical work of lawmen, if he does not also suggest that their work was superfluous. In German, in my language, this distinction is deeply rooted in the vocabulary. What Dante has in mind was justice, what we call in German Recht, that has nothing to do with law, the courts, and the practice of law. This is what we call Justiz. In short, and I'm quite sure that Kafka played with the two words, what is Justiz and what is law, Recht in German. In short, Dante transforms justice into something common to all human beings, a virtue by which everybody should be led. The highly sophisticated and to a certain extent artificial work of lawyers or experts of law is considered not only as unnecessary but also as harmful. Whereas in the first book of the Convivio, Dante fashions himself as a poet-philosopher devoted to give life and space to the rational animal in his listeners and readers, and thereby distances himself from the literati who sold and as a result ruined literature. In the fourth book, dedicated to nobility, he starts a polemic against the scholars of medicine and law, because his ambition by now surpasses literature. He is still a poet, but since he had the ambition to be part of the elite in the communal as well as the courtly society, he needs to compete with those who, thanks to a master degree and to teaching at universities, had been celebrated and even ennobled in the 14th century. I take the fourth book of the Convivio as a kind of fight against those who, through a university degree, attained high positions in the administrations and enjoyed great admiration. Dante's point is that they do not deserve to be ennobled because the way they offer their learning make them play by the rule of the economic market, which is not governed by virtue. The argument that justice only depends on common sense may therefore turn out to be a tactical move to promote the role of a poet. Let us now have a look at the two paragraphs in which Dante refers to the planned 14th book of the Convivio that should deal with justice. The first paragraph is placed in the introductory book of the treatise. Just wait a minute. It's here, yes. Thus, although every virtue in man is deserving of love, that is most deserving of love in him, which is most human, and that is justice, which resides in the rational or intellectual part, that is in the will. This is so deserving of love that, as the philosopher, that is Aristotle, says in the 5th book of the Ethics, they who are its enemies, such as thieves and robbers, love it, and therefore we see that its opposite, namely injustice, is hated most of all, as for example treachery, ingratitude, falsehood, theft, rapine, deceit, and the like. All of these are such inhuman sins that to exonerate of himself from being disgraced by them, it is granted through long custom that a person may speak of himself, as has been said above, and may declare himself faithful and loyal. Of this virtue I will speak more fully in the 14th book. The paragraph is placed within the arguments that Dante uses to defend the choice of the vernacular in the Convivio. The passage alludes to an earlier passage in which he explains under which condition an individual has the right to speak of himself. You see here the long custom, the apology. In the quote, justice is considered to be the first virtue that is closely linked to ratio, to the will. In other words, to what is specific to a human being. In his commentary, Fioravanti pointed out that Dante confounds Aristotle with Cicero here, and that the idea that evil criminals and thieves respect justice stems from a misunderstanding of Cicero's text. Cicero had simply stated that evil criminals imposed a kind of law code among their peers out of the sheer will to survive. I would like to draw your attention to another significant deviation from the Aristotelian model. According to Aristotle, justice is a virtue that is practiced and realized in offices, at least in relation to other people. The fact that this virtue is in a person depends on other people makes it so prominent in Aristotle's ethics. In Dante's view, however, justice is a virtue that mainly concerns the individual. Justice remains the leading virtue within a single person because it governs all the other virtues. It is only afterward that justice correlates with social life and has an impact on social life. Thus, Dante is mostly concerned with the individual who works on him or herself, on him or her ethical improvement, and who only after having done so becomes interested in passing on the ethical improvement to other people. For obvious reasons, I suppose the exiled Dante distills the Aristotelian notion to the mainly political and social dimension of justice. The second paragraph that points to the 14th book can be read in the 4th book. Dante explains the virtue of justice in the context of 4 ages in human life. And here I skip, there are several passages. It says that in old age, senetta is the Italian word, the noble soul is prudent, just, justa, liberal, and takes delight in speaking well of other virtues. And then if we skip the middle paragraph, it is also fitting in this age of life, the last one, to be just, so that one's judgment and authority may be a light and a law to others. Because this singular virtue, namely justice, was perceived by philosophers in ancient times to display itself to perfection in this age of life, they entrusted the rule of the cities to those who were in this age. According to Dante, justice emerges as a prime virtue in the last period of an individual life. Although the sense of justice that initially needs to know what is right and what is wrong resides in every human soul, the virtue itself calls for a lifelong practice and requires to be improved and perfected. Thus, it is in the last period of a human life that the virtue unfolds perfectly and can be passed on to other people, mostly to younger people. Dante, by the time he wrote the 4th book of the Convivio, was about to approach the last stage of human life. Apart from self-promoting his agency, this paragraph is another example that Dante places justice within the realm of moral philosophy, the same philosophy that the lady philosophy in the Convivio promotes. The 2 paragraphs do not offer enough clues to speculate on what Dante intended to write on justice in the 14th book. If we assume that he had the intention to comment on this in the Canzone Tre Donne in the 14th book, he would certainly have explained why he used the word drittura instead of justitia. Based on the hints and their context, we may only deduce that he would have commented on the concept of love in the context of philosophy, and probably have connected the notion of drittura with the love of moral philosophy. I presume He would have stressed this connection, since in the Convivio he surprisingly placed moral philosophy as the leading science, that is, the science which is supposed to lead all the other science except for theology, which is excluded in the treatise of the Convivio. He is likely to have conceived of moral philosophy as a knowledge that motivates the individual, and within which justice is, in the sense of Dirittura, plays a key role. Furthermore, if we take into consideration the hierarchy of sciences that Dante elaborates in the second book, it is striking that law and medical studies are excluded from the list of sciences, which mirrors the traditional system of the trivium and the quadrivium, and in addition contain 3 other sciences. The 8th sphere is linked to physics or natural science, the 9th, the primum mobile, to ethics, and the 10th to theology. In Dante's perspective, law and medicine do not figure as sciences. He therefore denies the status which both disciplines had already attained within the European University. In his list, he does not mention poetry as a science. However, poetry, at least in the form that Dante in exile tried to pursue, proved to be permeated or filled with philosophy, with the sort of science closest to truth. In the Convivio, I suspect Dante, as a poet who passes on his philosophical knowledge, finds himself primarily wrestling with competing professionals such as lawyers. He does not yet ennoble poetry by assigning it a place within the scholarly system of sciences. He rather strengthens the link between poetry and ethics that implies a rewriting or refashioning of the god Amor. If we now take a quick look for conclusion at the comedy, Divine Comedy, there are lawyers among the sinners, of course, but they do not enjoy a particular interest. Dante is no longer afraid of this social group. He dropped the name Accurcio, the very famous professor of law at the University of Bologna, but Accurcio's name had already become synonymous with avarice. Dante does not draw an individual character who exemplifies the sin of greed. In Paradise, those characters who are most linked to the idea of justice are not lawyers or judges. Among the just souls, as you know, we find the Emperor Trajan and the Trojan Ripheus. Both delivered justice even on petty causes without having studied law and without making money with it. We may even ask ourselves to which extent the selection of just souls is surprising because they are pagans, or also because they are experts, and they are not experts of the law. Furthermore, the Emperor Justinian, who speaks at the beginning of Paradise, is chosen by God to assemble and to collect the laws and to build a corpus juris. He does not have any legal training, and though he has certainly a team working for him, the idea of a scientifically based legal training is omitted. Dante does not want to acknowledge that it has been the Romans who transformed the rules of justice into a science by thoroughly studying single juridical decisions and their litigations. In the case of canon law, Dante in the Comedy says clearly that the Grecians' decrees, another collection of laws, are to be studied, whereas the Decretali, which are the recent decrees issued by the Pope and commented on by canon lawyers, provoked only confusion. In the Comedy, therefore, justice is based on a handful of clear-cut rules that every human being can understand and apply. In other words, the rule should be lived but not commented upon. Then, who is responsible for justice? I would say the answer is clear. Dante follows the Nicomachean ethics and claims that every single individual needs to learn how to embrace and to live the virtue of justice. The true poet, who is not guided by economic principles, may serve as an example and even as a guiding figure. Moreover, Dante's reflection on justice is part of a fight for a leading position in a changing communal society, as well as at princely or royal courts. In the comedy, however, he pushes the boundary and experiments with other ways of fashioning the poet, which are much more theological. The convivius find will be continued by Petrarch and Boccaccio, who try to ennoble the poet by defining the essence of poetry. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Franziska. I'm sure you'd all agree with that it was a wonderful, very dense and very rich lecture, and also a very complex one. You weren't expecting that on the second Monday of the semester. So I know there are going to be other questions. I'm going to jump in while those online might be wanting to formulate their questions. I know a couple of people here will want to ask questions as well. But I find it fascinating because when you brought it then into the realm of the commedia, we are talking, so people attribute this poem, the Tre Donne, for example, as one of this, early exiled Dante writing this, and this was going to be the council in which he was going to write the 14th chapter of the Convivio on this notion of justice. But as you kind of alluded to there, I was thinking about it, that I wonder if the Commedia itself is not so much Dante redefining what justice is, but redefining what poetry is and what the poet is. That it isn't so much the lawyer that is changing in his mind, because as he said, it's less of an issue in the Commedia. But the poet, the role of the poet and what the function of the poet is what has changed between the two things. And that when we think of, for example, even the simple example would be Dante's choice of Virgil as a guide, having a poet as a guide, and the fact that Dante encounters so many poet figures who teach him many different things. So I wonder if you could just speak to that, and another aspect of that as well, closely related. Just kind of thinking of examples, and you mentioned one or two lawyers. Could we not also think of, say, because we are being asked when we enter into the Inferno, there's the inscription on the portico, permessi vanno alle città dolente, permessi vanno all'eterno dolore, permessi va tra la gente, giustizia mosse il mio atto. So justice is divine justice in this case, but justice is placed front and center. But I wonder when you think about, say, somebody who would have a kind of a legalistic kind of background in Frederick II's court, Pier della Vigna, who was talking about the court and the Court Levites, and we were talking about this the other day. There's that wonderful line, and it isn't about justitia, but it is about what his action. As somebody who is both a rhetorician, with somebody who is more or less manipulating the emperor, being his sole advisor in political terms, but he says, injusta fecime contra me justa. So there is this notion of what justice is within the kind of court setting. And I wonder if there's any relation there to what you were saying.
Thank you so much for these wonderful questions and challenging questions. First point, I think you're right. In the comedy, it's much more about poetry, what poetry can, and what the definition of a poet. And in this sense, he goes back to the Vita Nova. He continues the idea of defining poet, a poeta, and not just someone who writes. And the other thing is, in the Convivio, he is much more the laical philosopher in the sense that he wants to pass on learning, because he said he collected the crumbles at the bottom of the table. So this is another, and but he uses poems, and I think it's not just, he could have written a treatise as a treatise, but he used poems, and he used a commentary on these poems to transmit knowledge, university or philosophical knowledge, and therefore the idea of poetry remains important. But still, if we take seriously, or if we get credit to the situation in the convivio that he speaks to a readership or to an audience of men and women at a court, so he seems to be at a court and to speak to people who do not have the time or do not know Latin, but are very interested in knowing more about philosophy. And so I think it is, if we take this context seriously, this means that he has competing there are other people who are secretaries of the governor or of the count or the king, and therefore he has to make a point. Why does he use poems, and why is it so important, and why is it he, a poet, who transmits scientific or academic knowledge? The other question, I think it's much more challenging. And in this sense, I would say it's the approach of Steinberg and other people who really make you understand the construction of the journey to the other world, and which is based on contracts, on forms of legal thinking, so to speak. And there's this idea of justice coming from God. And still, I think the justice in this idea of the drittura in the canzone, I think that justice coming from God is exactly this idea. You only need the 10 commandments, or you just need a specific role delivered by God himself, and this is what you have to practice, and you do not have to know anything else. And on the Inferno, the portal, it's justice and love. So you have the same connection as in the canzone. That justice or drittura speaks in front of the god Amor. But it's now another kind of love.
But interestingly, I mean, if we remind ourselves that Dante is a man who's writing this poem, the Commedia, he is, according to himself, this role of being judge and jury for everybody, and placing people in hell and purgatorio and in paradise. So the poet does become judge, jury, and ultimately the arbiter of justice in the end. On the best of those come. So that's enough from me. Are there any questions? And anyone online would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we can see. So we have a question here. Can I ask you a big favor, just for those online, if you wouldn't mind just walking up here, because there's a bit of a microphone here. If you don't mind, sorry about that.
Please.
Yeah.
So now I'm very close to you and not facing everybody else. So how can I do this better? So my question is, or more a reflection, I'm a legal academic, a professor of law, and when you were discussing the motivations why lawyers might have love for poetry and maybe that it's an unrequited love, one of the things that struck me is that the need to search for justice is not a small. I mean, so we can reduce the role of a lawyer to this technical, strategic, money-driven, kind of ambitious, career-focused type of role or vocation, but it mostly, I think, starts at least and ends maybe as something much deeper than that, and as a need to be part of a solution and be part of justice. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because necessarily you bring yourself closer to people who are suffering. and then you work through their problem for them, almost taking their problem on your own shoulders, at least for a time in your life. And then as it goes forward, either you win and it may turn out not to be all that's needed to resolve the situation for the person, or you lose, in which case the failure stays on you as much as it stays maybe on the shoulders of the person who suffers. So for all those reasons, I think there's a kind of deeper need for lawyers maybe to be close to poets. And I wonder, is that there somewhere in all of this, just as an undertone perhaps? And then on the flip side, I actually was wondering, is there a need for poets to or could it be said that there is kind of a need for poets to come closer to law insofar as that they maybe sometimes need to see some practical application, or to have some real effect in the world, a concrete kind of realization of some of their ambitions and ideals and things. So not really a question for you, but except insofar as I'm saying, would a little grain or a seed of that be there somewhere in all of these texts? Because I think it is there in the profession, in my friends and in my students, I see this kind of thing. So.
I think you're perfectly right. What I try to, or what I think we can grasp is it's a strategy, because there is a rivalry between two types. And if you take the history of literature, there are a lot of lawyers who became great writers. And therefore, legal training is like a basis of imagination and of writing. And for instance, this article by Kantorowicz, for me, it's one of the most beautiful, most inspiring articles, but it is really this idea of legal fictions. He explained that someone probably died, but they don't know it, and they need to have the fiction that he died and that he is dead in order to proceed with the property, etc. So there are a lot of common ways of proceeding, common ways of working, and therefore I do agree perfectly. But it's these poets at a certain point, they thought they should not mix up with lawyers. I think this is because they studied law, and even in the case of Petrarch and Boccaccio, we know that they practice. They studied and they practice. And even in a very cynical way, by the way. Boccaccio, for instance, gave very cynical advices to his friends. And in order to, there are these rules, you are not allowed to marry cousins. And so he said, just marry her and then send a letter to the Pope and say you didn't know about these rules, and then you get your dispense, and that was it. So they practice, but for internal reasons, for really poetical, or not poetical reasons, but for reasons of self-fashioning, they stated or they tried to get separated from lawyers and legal. But I think it's a play, it's a strategy, it's not reality.
So, are there any other questions? Tommaso, will you come up? Because we need to be able to hear you.
Thanks for very challenging for me. I would have two questions. One, if Dante overcome the dialectic of what you said, recte and justice, as is represented in the Antigone by Sophocles.
Mm-hmm.
And the second, if in some way the idea of poet in Dante in some way is similar to the idea of Heidegger's of poets as a prophecy, as a function of prophecy in a problematic age. These are my two questions.
The first thing in the concept of Antigone, I think you're it's an interesting question. But if you take the case of Franziska Rimini, this is justice, divine justice, in the sense of the German word Justiz. But you see the reactions of many readers up to our days who don't think that this is justice in the sense of German Recht. So I think it's Dante who, on the one hand, has this idea of a system, of a juridical divine system, but at the same time is a poet, and he knows how to describe, how to model individuality, people, individuals. And therefore, as readers, in my view, we are always between the two poles. On the one hand, we have to learn the divine justice, but on the other hand, we are attracted by these wonderful characters that are so complex, and the divine sentence or the divine judgment is not something we accept as a reader. And I think there's Dante in it. It's not a failure. It's a mastery of his work. Whereas the question concerning Heidegger and prophet in a problematic time, yes, why not? Yes, could be.
Are there any other questions? Elsina.
Yeah, thank you so much for should come here. Yeah. Very wonderful lecture. I was reflecting on two images. One is the image of the eagle. So in the Cielo di Giove, where Dante meets all the just spirits. And so just if you could like comment a bit on the relationship, on the role of the empire, because like the eagle as a symbol of the empire in all this. And the other was the image of the rose, because in one of your slides, I think in Convivio 4,
there is a rose.
Yeah.
There's a comparison with the rose.
Yeah,
and
that spreads the perfume as justice, as the virtuous justice. And if I don't know if what you think about a possible connection then with the image of the rose of the blessed, quindi I giusti, or I don't know, because the image of the rose has always been a bit in my mind. I was thinking if there might be some kind of relationship or connection.
The second question, I don't know, but it's very interesting, and I think we should think about it. So, first question about the eagle. I think it's interesting that the idea of the emperor, as Dante explains it in the Monarchia, it's someone who is above everything. So he does not have vices, or he does not, and this enables him to be a judge, to make peace with the people. So it's not in the sense an emperor has a good law system or has good legal lawyers, but this idea to create, it's the fiction of a man, of a person who is outside of or above everything, and therefore is not under the influence of vice and other things. So, but the idea of, because rose and eagle, it's I don't know. I have to think about it.
Thank you.
Oh, Pat, come on up. He's an old man, so it might take him a while to get to the top.
It's a great technique for reducing the number of questions, but actually, so I'm not, I don't know much about Dante, but I'm intrigued that he makes reference to Aristotle's ethics, and he's trying to present himself as a poet philosopher. I mean, is there any sense that in his work that he's reflecting as well upon kind of Plato's eviction of the poets from the Republic, because they've created these fictions which mock the gods. In other words, like, he's trying to claim so much for himself and for the poets, the creators of the fiction, the Universität of the gods. Is he not in some way trying to work out that contradiction, that alliance with the philosophers who, given that he's interested in the classical tradition, actually at least one strand of that pushed the poets away?
Okay,
Thank
yes. And he does not speak about the stage of Republic or in Plato's text.
Yeah.
And this is what you find in Boccaccio. Boccaccio is very explicit about it, but this comes from the discussion that even was triggered by Dante's Divine Comedy and by Dante's self-fashioning. And therefore there were a lot of opponents, and in this context, Plato was brought forward by humanists and others, and therefore Boccaccio proposed to read the passage of the expulsion, that it concerns not all the poets, but only those who wrote bad comedies. Not even so. The good comedies were accepted, but the bad one, the entertainers, and these are the men who had to be expelled.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, so I don't think there are any questions online. So just before we wrap up this evening, just to remind you about the rest of the series. So next week, we're going to have Professor Anna Pelleretti from Roma 3, and she's going to be talking with a paper entitled On the Border, the Dante Monument in Trento, which is a very significant Dante monument, and how it played a part in late 19th century and early 20th century politics in Italy. And so that's going to be very interesting. Then I think we have a break because of St. Bridget's Day. So and then we move back into Matthew Traherne, who's going to be coming over from Leeds, who's going to be talking about Dante and the future of finance. And so that's so any business colleagues you have, you might want to bring them down. We're going to critique every discipline in the university by the time we're finished. We're just starting with the lawyers. The medics got a bit of a smacking today, but we're going to save that up for next year maybe. And then Serena Vandy is going to be talking about Cosmic Dante, which I'm not quite sure what that will be about. I'm intrigued. And then the final lecture of the series would be Katie, who's going to be talking about 19th century travelers and how it is related to Dante. So it's a very mixed bag of Dante lectures that we have this year. So now that you have come, we know your faces, we know your names. You are now, that means you have to come to all the other lectures. And so if you're not, we will hunt you down and we will find you. And that's why you haven't. So thank you for coming out this evening. But before we go this evening, please will you join me in thanking Franziska Meier.